This is a riveting geopolitical thriller script that chronicles a real-world maritime confrontation between the United States and Iran over a sanctioned oil tanker. The narrative masterfully weaves together military operations, naval tactics, and strategic brinkmanship into a compelling account of how American naval superiority and coordinated interagency response defeated Iranian attempts to protect a sanction-busting vessel operating under the Islamic Republic's strategic direction. The story begins with the Coast Guard cutter Monroe tracking the 330-meter oil tanker Marinara as it attempts to reach Iranian territorial waters, carrying sanctioned cargo destined for ports controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. At the heart of this confrontation lies a deliberate Iranian strategy rooted in years of asymmetrical naval warfare doctrine. Rather than attempting to match American naval firepower directly, Iran has historically relied on swarming tactics with fast attack craft, submarine threats, and the calculated deployment of unconventional assets to create impossible choices for American decision-makers. By positioning multiple Revolutionary Guard speedboats on intercept courses and threatening to swarm the boarding operation, Tehran calculated that American boarding teams would face an unacceptable risk. The mathematics were straightforward from Iran's perspective. Either the Americans back off and the tanker reaches safety in Iranian territorial waters where American military options become severely constrained, or they attempt to board the ship while facing coordinated attacks from multiple Iranian naval assets designed to inflict casualties and create a political crisis. The strategy reflected decades of Iranian naval doctrine, centered on the asymmetrical challenge to American dominance in the Persian Gulf and surrounding waters. Rather than accepting Iran's limited options, the United States executed a brilliant strategy involving multiple layers of complexity designed to counter every element of Iranian doctrine simultaneously. The visible response was carefully constructed to be seen by Iranian intelligence services and broadcast through every tracking system available to Tehran. Massive C-17 Globemaster transports landed at RAF bases across the United Kingdom carrying MH-60 Blackhawks, MH-40-77 Chinooks, AC-130 gunships equipped devastating firepower, and aircraft belonging to the legendary 660th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, whose reputation for executing complex operations in denied environments preceded them. Flight tracking websites lit up with tail numbers and aircraft movements. Intelligence analysts in Tehran and throughout the region monitored every piece of equipment being staged at British air bases and published the information almost in real time through open-source intelligence channels. The message being transmitted was unmistakable and deliberately obvious. America was bringing overwhelming hardware to handle anything Iran put in the water or sky. The visible deployment included signals intelligence aircraft, airborne early warning systems, and transport capacity that could move strike packages into theater within hours. But that was theater, a carefully choreographed performance designed to focus Iranian attention on the obvious while the real strike package remained hidden in plain sight. The actual boarding operation assets had already been at sea the entire time, riding aboard the Monroe and affiliated naval vessels, waiting for the weather window that would make a complex tactical seizure feasible. This deception strategy was critical because Iranian intelligence monitoring of open-source flight data would naturally assume that the boarding operation would be supported by assets flowing in from Europe. Instead, every tactical element needed for the seizure had been present from the beginning, prepositioned, and concealed within the regular naval task force that Iran had been tracking for days. The Iranian Navy's fundamental challenge centered on the technological and tactical asymmetry that has defined American naval operations in the region for decades. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy operates primarily from bases in the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. But the confrontation with the Marinara was occurring far from Iranian home waters, in the North Atlantic where the operational environment heavily favors American capabilities. The IRGC Navy's fast attack craft, while dangerous in congested waters near Iranian coasts, face severe limitations when operating at significant distances from support infrastructure. Their submarine fleet, composed primarily of older diesel-electric boats and relatively unsophisticated midget submarines, lacks the endurance and technological sophistication required for extended operations in deep ocean environments. Iran's strategy therefore relied heavily on the psychological impact of the threat, rather than technological superiority. The U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, deployed from forward operating locations, represented a technological capability that Iran's submarine force was virtually incapable of countering. The P-8 carried 129 sonobuoys, essentially sophisticated underwater acoustic sensors that could detect submarine propulsion signatures, hull creaking, and machinery noises across hundreds of square miles of ocean. These were not the sonobuoys of the Cold War era, but advanced sensors capable of transmitting acoustic data to the coordinating aircraft and to surface naval assets. The physics of submarine detection fundamentally favor the hunter in these circumstances. Sound travels 4 times faster in water than in air, and a submarine's machinery vibrations at specific frequencies can propagate 60 miles or more through deep ocean channels where temperature layers and salinity gradients create acoustic waveguides. A submarine attempting to transit at operational speed while remaining undetected faces a thermodynamic and acoustic equation that cannot be solved through conventional tactics. The submarine must be quieter than all ambient noise while maintaining sufficient speed to reach its intercept course deadline. The metaphor is perfect for understanding the futility of the Iranian position. Trying to sneak past an alert and technologically superior adversary is like attempting to return home undetected at 3 in the morning when your spouse is already awake and alert. No matter how quietly you move, the advantage has already shifted. You are simply deciding between different categories of consequences. Multiple allied nations contributed to the surveillance network that neutralized the Iranian submarine threat before it could develop into an operational problem. A Royal Air Force P-8 Poseidon covered the North Sea approaches. A Norwegian P-8 monitored the Norwegian Sea, watching for any Iranian assets that might have been pre-positioned in northern waters. Most critically, an RAF RC-135 Joint Signals Intelligence aircraft maintained continuous coverage, intercepting every Iranian naval communication in the theater, providing real-time intelligence on Iranian intentions, tactical movements, and command and control communications. This 3-nation submarine hunting network shared data in real time through NATO's integrated air defense system, creating a surveillance architecture that became progressively more lethal with every nautical mile an Iranian submarine advanced toward the boarding operations location. The coordination between American, British, and Norwegian forces represented exactly the kind of allied integration that Iran's asymmetrical doctrine was fundamentally incapable of countering. The Iranian submarine that eventually entered the operational area quickly discovered the futility of its position. The specific class designation and performance characteristics indicated that Iranian naval architects had focused on regional operations in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf rather than blue water transit. When the Iranian submarine attempted to sprint at maximum speed to clear the sonobuoy barrier that the American P-8 had established, the American aircraft had already deployed a second defensive pattern 5 miles ahead on the projected intercept course. The submarine commander, faced with sonobuoys indicating detection, attempted the standard Cold War evasion tactic of hiding in the noise generated by commercial shipping lanes, positioning his boat in the acoustic shadow of container ships whose powerful propulsion systems generated sufficient acoustic clutter to potentially mask submarine signatures. For several hours, this tactic appeared effective. Then, the RAF Rivet Joint Signals Intelligence and its aircraft intercepted course change orders transmitted by Iranian naval headquarters to the submarine, providing real-time visibility into the Iranian submarine commander's decision-making process. The American P-8 pilot, armed with the intelligence intercept, repositioned the aircraft to establish a new sonobuoy pattern exactly along the course the submarine commander had just ordered. The Iranian submarine was not hiding in the commercial shipping noise. It was being actively hunted by adversaries who were reading its encrypted communications and predicting its movements in real time. The psychological impact on the Iranian submarine commander must have been profound. The fundamental assumption of submarine operations that your movements are hidden from your adversary had been completely negated. The American and Allied aircraft demonstrated not just the ability to detect the submarine, but the capability to predict its actions before they were executed. When the Iranian submarine commander attempted more sophisticated evasion tactics, diving below the thermocline where temperature gradients scatter acoustic energy and attempting battery-powered near-silent transit to minimize the acoustic signature, the American naval response simply shifted to a different technological domain. The P-8s deployed depth-set buoys positioned below the thermal layer, re-establishing acoustic contact in the Iranian submarine's purported sanctuary. Simultaneously, the American destroyers approaching the boarding area activated magnetic anomaly detection systems that could sense the massive steel hull and propulsion systems of a submarine, regardless of how silent the machinery had become. A submarine cannot stop being thousands of tons of heavy metal, and that immutable physical reality meant that technological silence was an insufficient defense against adversaries equipped with multiple detection modalities. Every Iranian evasion maneuver consumed the one irreplaceable resource the submarine commander possessed: time. While the submarine twisted and turned through the ocean trying to avoid detection, while it sprinted and drifted and dove and rose again, every hour spent in evasion was another hour that American forces bought to position their boarding teams, and another hour closer to the weather window that would permit the tactical seizure. By evening on January 6th, the American naval response in the surface layer had coalesced into overwhelming force. Two Arleigh Burke-class guided destroyers, the USS Bulkley and the USS Paul Ignatius, joined the Monroe Formation around the Marinara. Each Burke displaces 9,200 tons and represents one of the most sophisticated integrated combat systems ever deployed to sea. Each carried an Aegis combat system, 96 vertical launch cells equipped with a variety of weapons systems capable of engaging targets from subsurface to space altitudes, and the ANSU-89 sonar suite purpose-built specifically to detect, track, and engage submarine targets. One Arleigh Burke destroyer carries more integrated firepower than most nations can project to sea in their entire national fleets. The United States had now positioned two of them in direct support of the boarding operation. The addition of these destroyers meant that the American task force possessed organic anti-submarine warfare capabilities that were not dependent on external support aircraft. The destroyer sonar suites locked onto the Iranian submarine's acoustic signature the moment they received targeted downloaded from the P-8s overhead, giving the surface combatant continuous real-time tracking that persisted regardless of weather visibility or the Iranian submarine's evasion attempts. The destroyer's next action communicated a message so blunt that no ambiguity could possibly exist regarding American intentions and capabilities. The Aegis combat system activated active sonar in full power mode, the acoustic equivalent of a searchlight sweeping across the ocean. The active sonar pulses, generated by an Arleigh Burke destroyer operating at full power, are not subtle surveillance tools, but physical forces that rattle the fittings and structure of submarines within range. The sound energy penetrates the pressure hull and echoes through every compartment, creating an acoustic environment inside the submarine that can be described as hostile and deliberately intimidating. The message being transmitted through every ping was unambiguous to the Iranian submarine commander. I know precisely where you are located, and I am not attempting to hide that knowledge or to subtly encourage your departure. I am communicating my awareness to you and your government simultaneously because I want there to be no possible misunderstanding regarding the situation. The Iranian submarine commander was a professional military officer with years of experience in the Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, and he understood with complete clarity exactly what the active sonar pings meant. The Americans were not pinging to locate him. They already had his position fixed to high precision from multiple independent sources. They were pinging to ensure that he understood the consequences of any hostile action. The Iranian submarine's carrying capability was limited to older Russian-origin torpedo tubes, and theoretically the submarine could have attempted to fire a weapon at the American destroyers or the Coast Guard cutter. But the Iranian commander also understood that the moment such a weapon was fired, the engagement would transition posturing, and positioning to lethal surface action, in which the American destroyers would respond with an anti-submarine rocket that could fly to the submarine's location and deploy a Mikiki-50 torpedo capable of homing on the Iranian vessel near perfect accuracy. The rocket transit time from launch to impact was approximately 30 seconds, and from that moment until impact the submarine would be engaging a homing torpedo that could not be outrun or confused by conventional countermeasures. Immediately following the first torpedo impact, the American destroyers would launch a comprehensive salvo additional anti-submarine weapons from their 96 vertical launch cells, ensuring that the Iranian submarine would not survive to fire a second weapon or to assess the damage from the initial attack. The arithmetic of submarine warfare against the most powerful navy on Earth is brutally simple. If you fire first and fail to achieve a decisive victory, you will not survive the response. The Iranian submarine commander had traveled thousands of miles from his home port, burning months of supply stockpiles and operational tempo to position himself for this mission. He was there under standing orders to escort and protect the Marinara, to demonstrate Iranian resolve and challenge American willingness to execute a boarding operation. But he was not there under orders to commit suicide or to sacrifice his boat and crew in a futile engagement against superior firepower and technology. The more sophisticated calculation was that his presence, combined with the threat of Iranian attack boats swarming from closer positions, would create sufficient risk to cause American decision-makers to hesitate or to delay the boarding operation long enough for the Marinara to reach Iranian territorial waters where the situation would transform entirely. The fundamental problem with this Iranian strategy was that American decision-makers had not hesitated. Instead, they had positioned overwhelming force, demonstrated complete awareness of all Iranian assets, and communicated through every possible channel that the boarding operation would proceed regardless of Iranian posturing. The distance between the Marinara and Iranian territorial waters was shrinking by the hour, making 9 knots toward the finish line that would make it untouchable under international law. The Iranian submarine, despite its theoretical speed advantage, was burning through time and battery power conducting evasion maneuvers that were not preventing American detection, merely delaying its inevitable arrival in the operational area. The 3 clocks that were running simultaneously, the tanker's distance to safety, the submarine's distance to intercept, and the gradually improving weather conditions were converging in a way that heavily favored the American boarding operation. But one variable remained beyond anyone's complete control: the Atlantic weather in January. For 16 days, the North Atlantic had been executing its characteristic January routine of battering the region with 15-foot swells, horizontal rain driven by 40-knot winds, and visibility measured in yards rather than miles. Helicopter operations in these conditions are not merely difficult, they are extraordinarily dangerous, and no competent military commander would permit boarding operations to be conducted when personnel could be lost to weather rather than hostile action. The Coast Guard and Navy helicopter pilots, supported by sailors and special operators, waited through those 16 days for conditions that would permit complex tactical air operations. The wait was agonizing because every day that the weather held was another day the Marinara progressed toward safety. Every day of delay was another day the Iranian submarine consumed in its transit. The American boarding teams were ready, positioned, equipped, and trained, but they remained grounded by meteorological conditions beyond military control. Then on the morning of January 7th, the Atlantic weather pattern fractured and transformed. The swells that had been running 15 feet dropped suddenly to 4 feet. The winds that had been driving horizontal rain decreased dramatically, giving pilots actual visibility beyond their immediate vicinity. The fog and mist that had obscured the horizon opened to reveal actual miles of clear ocean. For the first time in 16 days, the weather window that American commanders had been waiting for materialized. Conditions were no longer perfect. The North Atlantic in January never provides perfection. They had crossed the threshold from impossible to merely difficult. That transition meant the boarding operation could proceed. The window had opened. After weeks of positioning, surveillance, coordination with allies, and patient waiting, it was time to execute the actual seizure. The morning air was thick with haze, residual moisture from the storm system that had finally broken and moved eastward toward Europe. The gray conditions blurred the line between ocean and sky in a way that made the distant Marinara appear almost like a ghost ship emerging from the mist. On the Monroe's flight deck, the Coast Guard MH-65 Dolphin helicopter began its startup sequence, rotors beginning their characteristic acceleration, from stillness through vibration to the blur of full rotational speed. The Maritime Special Response Team, the Coast Guard's Tier 1 ship seizure unit trained and equipped for exactly these kinds of high-risk boarding operations, loaded into the helicopter with their full complement of equipment. They carried weapons, breaching equipment, flex cuffs for securing crew members, rappelling gear, and all the other tactical and technical equipment required to execute a hostile ship seizure 300 miles from the nearest hospital or medical facility. These operators represented years of training and experience in maritime law enforcement and tactical operations. They had rehearsed this exact scenario countless times in training, but this boarding would be different because the Marinara's crew had already refused one boarding attempt and had no reason to cooperate with subsequent American efforts. The MH-65 lifted off from the Monroe's flight deck, cleared the naval ship's superstructure, and banked toward the Marinara's silhouette in the haze. From half a mile out, the 330-meter tanker filled the helicopter windshield, a massive commercial vessel with a rust-streaked hull, crudely painted name that was already peeling after weeks of salt spray and corrosion, and the Iranian flag painted on its stumble that had sparked this entire operational sequence. The MH-65 pilot circled once to confirm the fast rope insertion point on the forward deck, examining the surface carefully to ensure it was clear of obstacles and hazards that could complicate the boarding. Below on the tanker's weather deck, crew members were visible watching the helicopter approach. The Iranian crew had been briefed on the situation and had probably received instructions from their government about what to expect. The crew had been told that if American boarding teams attempted to seize the ship, the force would be small and manageable, something that the Iranian Navy could potentially respond to before the boarding achieved irreversible momentum. The MH-65 pilot brought the helicopter into a hover directly above the Marinara's forward deck and held the position steady despite the residual ocean swells and wind conditions. The ropes went out, thick rappelling lines that will allow the Coast Guard operators to descend rapidly from the aircraft to the deck below. The MSRT operators checked their tactical kit, won final safeties on weapons, carabiners properly locked on rappelling harnesses, gloves positioned for secure grip, communication systems tested. From the tanker's bridge, the captain watched the single Coast Guard helicopter approaching from the Monroe, the same cutter that had been following them for weeks. The situation appeared manageable. One helicopter, one cutter, 33 crew members, who had been briefed that the boarding would look exactly like this, small enough that the Iranian Navy would have time to respond before the boarding became irreversible. The captain reached for his radio to transmit a distress signal to Bandar Abbas and to Iranian naval headquarters ashore, alerting them that the American boarding was commencing so that Iranian naval response forces could begin their reaction. He never completed transmission. At the precise moment when the Coast Guard operators were beginning their fast rope descent, when the captain's hand was reaching for his radio microphone, when Iranian naval commanders ashore were waiting for the distress call that would trigger their response, two shapes emerged from the haze directly behind the MH-65. They appeared as if by supernatural materialization, MH-6M Little Bird helicopters, each weighing less than 3,000 pounds, barely larger than an automobile, small enough that the entire aircraft could fit inside a C-130 Hercules cargo plane. The little birds slid into formation along the Coast Guard's helicopter with the precision of birds moving together through the sky, aircraft that should not have been present and had not been detected by Iranian surveillance until they were already bearing down on the tanker's position. The Night Stalkers, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, had conducted one of the finest deception operations in modern military history, while the entire intelligence and surveillance apparatus of Iran was focused on the massive C-17 transports landing at RAF bases across England, while Iranian analysts were tracking every piece of it being unloaded and every aircraft tail number being recorded. The actual boarding strike package had been riding aboard the Coast Guard cutter Monroe for the previous 2 weeks. The MH-6M Little Birds, sophisticated special operations helicopters that represented some of the most capable airmobile insertion platforms in the world, had been sealed within the naval convoy the entire time. The Navy SEALs had been staging from the Monroe itself, conducting their pre-boarding rehearsals in secret, while Iranian intelligence focused exclusively on the visible buildup at English air bases. The crew of the Marinara was now watching 3 helicopters bearing down on their position, where 30 seconds prior there had been only 1. The Little Birds carried Navy SEALs on external bench seats, legs dangling over the North Atlantic in January, armed operators positioned where the Iranian crew could see them clearly. The MH-6 does not provide weather protection. It is fundamentally an open-air platform that moves passengers through weather faster than ground-based vehicles. 300 miles from the nearest coastline, in a helicopter that weighs less than a pickup truck, carrying heavily armed special operations personnel positioned where visibility was maximum, it represented a moment of profound psychological impact for the Iranian crew. Nobody had predicted this. IRGC naval commanders had not anticipated this. The analysis that had informed Iranian strategy had not accounted for this possibility. The Marinara's crew was now watching American Special Operations helicopters position themselves, with clear line of sight to the tanker, operators visibly armed, representing a level of force and capability that had materialized from nowhere. The first operators to actually land on the Marinara's deck were not Navy SEALs. They were the Coast Guard Maritime Special Response Team, the team whose federal legal authority was absolutely critical to the operation's legitimacy. Only the United States Coast Guard possesses federal authority to execute seizure warrants on the high seas. This legal reality explains why a Coast Guard cutter had spent weeks in January storms rather than a Navy destroyer, why a Coast Guard helicopter conducted the initial fast rope insertion, and why the ultimate boarding operation was executed under Coast Guard command authority. The military had built the operation. The military had protected it through overwhelming force and sophisticated surveillance. But the Coast Guard would take the ship, execute the seizure, and place the captured vessel under U.S. federal jurisdiction. The MSRT operators fast-roped from the MH-65 onto the Marinara's forward deck, sliding down thick ropes at controlled speed onto a surface that had been pitching violently for weeks and was now, for the first time since the pursuit began, stable enough to land on safely. These operators were not standard boarding teams. They trained alongside Navy SEALs and Delta Force operators, learning the techniques and tactics of Tier 1 Special Operations units. The reason for this elevated training was not glamour or prestige but legal authority. Only the Coast Guard could execute this seizure warrant, which meant that the Coast Guard personnel conducting the boarding had to possess the tactical and technical capabilities to execute a hostile boarding against a resistant crew without requiring military command authority. The boarding teams went for the bridge first, and with overwhelming speed and violence of action designed to prevent any meaningful resistance. Communications were secured, navigation systems were locked, scuttling valves and mechanisms were disabled in the opening seconds. If the Marinara's captain had managed to transmit his distress signal to Bandar Abbas before the boarding teams reached the wheelhouse, the entire situation would have transformed into a different legal and tactical scenario. A distress call from a ship flying the Iranian flag and presumably operating under Iranian authority would have given the Iranian Navy a potential legal basis for responding to the call, creating a situation where Iranian surface combatant responding distress call would have different legal standing than a submarine lurking on an intercept course. But the captain never transmitted that signal. The MSRT was on the bridge before the crew understood what was actually happening, before they could organize any resistance, before they'd transmit communications that would trigger Iranian response forces. Within 90 seconds of the first operator's boots touching the Marinara's bridge, the Monroe's Combat Information Center received confirmation. Bridge secured, all communications dark, crew members flex-cuffed and moved to a secure holding area on the bridge wing. The Marinara was no longer transmitting on any frequency, no longer broadcasting distress signals or positioning information or technical details that could guide Iranian forces to intercept or assist. The MSRT immediately split into clearing teams and began the methodical process of working down through the ship's interior spaces. This was not a simple occupation bridge, but a complete and comprehensive of a massive commercial vessel. Narrow corridors designed for merchant sailors rather than tactical operators, steep ladderways connecting compartments, passageways illuminated in red light to preserve the night vision capabilities of crew members on watch. Every hatted up a potential blind corner. Every compartment had to be cleared methodically before the team could move forward. Assumptions of compliance were not made. Every space was treated as potentially hostile until exhaustively searched and secured. The engineering spaces received particular attention because whoever controls the engine room controls where a 330-meter oil tanker travels. The engineering crew could theoretically scuttle the vessel, flood compartments, or disable propulsion systems if given sufficient time and coordination. The MSRT teams worked through the engineering spaces with professional efficiency, born of countless training iterations and real-world experience. Every crew member was located, accounted for, flexcuffed, and moved under guard. 33 crew members were systematically searched, separated to prevent communication and coordination, and secured under guard. Behind the tactical clearing teams came the evidence collection units, chain of custody personnel, digital forensics specialists, and documentation teams. Every navigation log, every communication record, every computer hard drive that could potentially contain evidence of sanctions violations was carefully documented, photographed, and preserved for eventual presentation in federal court. The Marinara had been operating with sanctioned crew for years, conducting transits that deliberately moved sanctioned cargo through international waters in violation of U.S. sanctions regimes. The digital evidence that the boarding teams collected satellite communication records, navigation logs showing intentional course alterations to avoid Coast Guard detection, crew rosters with connections to sanctioned entities would eventually sit before a federal judge as the prosecutorial case against the vessel and its corporate operators. Above the deck, the little birds circled in slow orbital patterns, seals positioned on the external benches, weapons clearly visible to anyone observing the deck below. The scene captured on the Marinara's own camera systems that were streaming video feeds to Iranian state media in real time. The footage caught everything with clarity. The egg-shaped fuselage of the MH-6 little birds, the operators positioned on the external skids, the deliberate orbital patterns maintaining overwatch of the now captured tanker, the obvious capability and professionalism of the special operations personnel. Nobody on the Marinara needed a translator to understand what the imagery meant. Every crew member, every Iranian government official monitoring the feeds in real time, every analyst in Tehran assessing the situation understood with perfect clarity. They were standing on a tanker deck that had just been seized by the United States Coast Guard, supported by Navy SEALs who were visibly armed and maintaining overwatch from circling helicopters. Organized resistance to the occupation was not merely unwise, it would be suicidal. The intelligent decision was to comply fully, cooperate with the boarding teams, and preserve lives that would otherwise be put at risk by attempting to contest possession with personnel carrying assault rifles and years of special operations training. The boarding operation represented the culmination of weeks of planning, international coordination, technological innovation, and patient waiting for the precise moment when all variables aligned to permit execution. The United States Navy and Coast Guard had deployed submarines of their own to establish dominance in the underwater domain. They had coordinated with British, Norwegian, and other NATO allies to create a comprehensive surveillance net that Iranian assets could not penetrate. They had staged special operations assets in plain sight, while concealing the true boarding strike package from Iranian intelligence analysis. They had positioned surface combatants with overwhelming firepower to deter any Iranian military response. They had waited through 16 days of terrible weather for the window that would permit helicopter operations. And when all pieces had been positioned and the moment arrived, they had executed a boarding operation with precision and overwhelming force that left no ambiguity regarding American resolve or capability. The Iranian strategy, based on asymmetrical tactics and calculated intimidation, had failed completely. The submarine that had transited so far from home had been tracked continuously and rendered through technological superiority and Allied coordination. The fast attack craft that had positioned themselves to swarm the boarding operation had been deterred by the overwhelming display of military force. The diplomatic gambit that had assumed American hesitation or unwillingness to execute the boarding had been proven false. The Marinara reached Iranian territorial waters. Never it was captured, seized, and placed under U.S. federal custody thousands of miles from safety. The operation vindicated the American strategy of maintaining technological superiority, fostering Allied relationships that permit real-time intelligence sharing, and demonstrating unwavering resolve in the face of Iranian challenges to the international sanctions regime. It demonstrated that asymmetrical tactics, while genuinely dangerous in certain contexts, cannot prevail against opponents who possess superior technology, better strategic planning, and the political will to execute complex operations against sophisticated targets. Most fundamentally, it illustrated that Iran's challenge to U.S. Coast Guard authority at sea represented a strategic miscalculation with consequences that would reverberate through Tehran's national security decision-making for years to come.